All right, let's jump right in. Today we're going to explore this really amazing framework that helps make sense of the huge cultural differences we see all over the world. This is all based on decades of incredible research from the World Value Survey, so let's get into it.
So to get us started, let's think about a really big question. Why is it that different societies have such wildly different takes on something like gender roles? It feels super complex, right? But it turns out the data shows a surprisingly clear pattern.
And here's the key. So much of that variation, across almost 100 different countries, really just boils down to two major dimensions. You could almost think of them as two axes, like a GPS that can map the entire cultural world.
Okay, our first axis is all about autonomy. Basically, what people prioritize most in life. It's a spectrum, and it runs all the way from a focus on just basic survival to a focus on individual self-expression.
And this creates a really fundamental tension. See, on one end, you have societies that are laser-focused on economic and physical security above everything else. But on the other end, you have societies where things like quality of life and personal freedom really take center stage.
So let's look at that first pole, survival values. These tend to emerge in societies that are facing what researchers call existential insecurity. Makes sense, right? When your actual survival isn't a given, when you're worried about basic needs, that's going to shape your entire worldview.
And that worldview has some really specific traits. Societies that score high in survival values, well, they tend to have lower levels of trust between people. They're often less tolerant of outsiders. And, you guessed it, they also lean heavily toward traditional gender roles and a more authoritarian outlook, seeing rigid rules as the best way to keep things predictable in a very uncertain world.
Now, let's flip it and look at the other end of that spectrum, self-expression values. These really start to become widespread in post-industrial societies, where, for most people, survival can be taken for granted. The whole focus shifts from just security to flourishing.
And this is where we get a direct answer to that big question we started with. Societies that prioritize self-expression also show a growing tolerance for outgroups, they demand more of a say in how they're governed, and, this is crucial, they show really high support for gender equality.
Okay, so that's axis number one. Now for our second axis. This one isn't so much about personal goals, it's about the source of authority in a society. In other words, where do the rules come from? The past or the present?
And this creates another one of those core tensions. Do people look to religion, to deference, to those time-honored family structures for guidance? Or do they look to science, the government, and individual reason?
On one side, you have what we call traditional values. These are societies that hold religion in very high regard. They put a huge emphasis on strong parent-child bonds, and they believe in deference to authority, whether that's God, the country, or the family.
These values come with a pretty clear set of social norms. You usually see very high national pride and a deep reverence for traditional institutions. And this also usually means rejecting things that are seen as undermining that tradition, like divorce, abortion, and euthanasia.
The opposite pole here is defined by secular rational values. In these societies, authority doesn't come from tradition. Instead, people place way less emphasis on religion and much more on logic, science, and state institutions.
And just as you'd expect, the social norms are basically the inverse of the traditional ones. In secular rational societies, individual choice in moral matters is highly valued, and so issues like divorce, abortion, and euthanasia are generally seen as relatively acceptable.
Okay, so we have our two axes, survival versus self-expression, and traditional versus secular rational. Now for the really cool part. Let's put them together and see the big picture they create.
Because when you plot countries on these two dimensions, something pretty remarkable happens. A cultural map of the world just appears. And you find that societies start clustering together not by geography, but by their shared values.
And this just illustrates the patterns so brilliantly. Look down in the bottom left quadrant. You see societies high in both traditional and survival values, places like Jordan and Bangladesh. Now look all the way up in the top right. You find societies high in both secular rational and self-expression values, like Sweden and Germany. And of course, you've got everything in between, from Latin America to the Confucian countries to Russia.
So let's bring this all the way back to our original question. A society that prioritizes survival values is just much more likely to insist on traditional gender roles and feel threatened by cultural change. But a society that really emphasizes self-expression values, it tends to see things like gender equality and diversity not as threats, but as positives.
So the point is, this is absolutely crucial. As the researchers themselves put it, the whole debate over gender roles is a central battleground along this axis. It's not some side issue, it's a core piece of this global shift in values.
So that begs the question, right? Why do societies move around on this map in the first place? Well, the data points to one primary engine driving all of this cultural change: socioeconomic development.
The data suggests it's kind of a two-step process. First, industrialization tends to push societies upward on the map, from traditional towards secular rational values, basically as science and bureaucracy replace religion as the main organizing force. Then, the shift to a post-industrial, knowledge-based economy pushes them to the right, from survival towards self-expression values, as that existential security becomes the norm for more and more people.
So, just how powerful is this model? It's kind of astonishing, actually. These two dimensions, all by themselves, explain over 70% of the variation in human values from one nation to another. I mean, that is a huge amount of predictive power.
You know, at the end of the day, this isn't just some academic exercise. This framework really helps us understand real-world stuff. Everything from demands for democracy and environmental protection to, yes, that global rise in support for gender equality.
And that leaves us with one last, big, provocative question. While it seems like development pushes societies in a pretty similar direction on the map, their distinct cultural histories, they still persist. So as we all move into the future, are we all slowly heading toward the same destination? Or will our unique histories always keep us on slightly different paths? It's definitely something to think about.